Right, Mike. We also had Notre Dame take on BC. The Irish kick it into gear in the second half. BC came out and played a really good, strong defensive first half, and then it got away from them, and the Irish's talent took over in a 49-20 win. Your thoughts about Notre Dame and BC as well?
For Boston College, I thought it was their best offensive output of the season. Running the football, John Hillman looked like the John Hillman of old from a few years ago, pre-injury. Hillman had 122 yards on 22 carries, by far his most impressive performance of the season. Anthony Brown looked good, threw a couple bad interceptions, but overall, I think you'll take it. 215 yards passing, 24-40. On the day. If you're a Boston College fan, you're looking at the quarterback position. I mean, there is a lot of promise there with Anthony Brown. He's kind of had an uneven first few weeks of the year, but he's looked much better overall, I think, than a lot of quarterbacks they've had there in quite some time. So I think you take solace in that. Defensively, I thought the will of Boston College was broken in the second half. Notre Dame ends up running for 515 yards and 7 touchdowns, which extremely problematic. Brandon Wimbush, the quarterback, had 207 yards and 4 touchdowns. Josh Adams, Notre Dame starting running back, went 18 carries for 229 yards. Dexter Williams, 6 carries, 50 yards, and 2 scores when the game was already out of reach. What's problematic for Notre Dame through 3 weeks is that the passing game is not nearly as potent as a lot of people expected it to be. I think the one thing to watch out for here is the receiver, specifically with Notre Dame. I don't think the ceiling is nearly as high as a lot of people expected it to be. Equanimeous St. Brown was one of the best players on the team last year. Granted, it was a very bad Notre Dame team, but he was one of the few bright spots as a true freshman last year, playing as well as he did. And Notre Dame's really just struggled to throw the football here through 3 weeks. They looked okay against Temple. Again, take that with a grain of salt because it is Temple. They struggled for the most part throwing the football last weekend at home against Georgia, a game that they ended up losing. And yesterday afternoon, 11 of 24 throwing for Brandon Wimbush, 93 yards and an interception. Not the greatest performance there for Wimbush. So, throwing the football is a bit of a concern, but if Notre Dame can run for 515 yards, it might not matter, especially against the caliber of competition they're going to go up against here in the coming weeks. There are a lot of winnable games, I think, on Notre Dame's schedule, maybe a lot more winnable games than some people expected, maybe even a week or two ago. Stanford doesn't look nearly as good as a lot of people expected them to. They're 1-2 through 3 games, but David Shaw usually has that team playing well at the right time of year. Notre Dame gets them on the road at the end of the year this season. So don't expect that to be a complete pushover, but maybe Stanford isn't quite as good as a lot of people expected. You look at a team like USC, who Notre Dame faces here in mid-October. Now, Notre Dame should win the rest of their games until they play USC, but they're going to be in a spot there in South Bend where they're going to have a great opportunity to win that football game. Because you look at USC right now, and USC might not be the team we expected them to be. USC looked a little bit questionable in week 1 against Western Michigan, ended up pulling out the W. Last weekend, they beat a Stanford team that a lot of people thought was a lot better than they actually are. Stanford, of course, has lost now 2 in a row to both USC and San Diego State. But, you look at that USC win last week, you come away really impressed, and then you see Stanford lose last night to San Diego State, and you're thinking, oh, man, how good is this Stanford team? Well, USC beats them last week, and then they go to double overtime to beat a Texas team that gave up 51 points to Maryland in week 1. So I'm sitting here wondering, in a home game at night in the Coliseum, you have no business going to double overtime against a team like Texas. Now, granted, Tom Herman, great big game coach. He's done it in the past. He's pulled off upsets with, far lesser teams than he has right now at Texas. It's a steep rebuild for the Longhorns program, and they were right in that game last night. But if I'm a USC fan, I'm a little bit concerned overall. So, I think Notre Dame's got a lot more winnable games on the schedule than a lot of people expected them to be or to have. But, the passing game really needs to come around for them to ultimately win some of these games that were maybe looked a little bit more losable here even a week or two ago.
So let's let that sink in. 515 yards of rushing offense for Notre Dame against BC. So Josh Adams and company, they really ripped apart Temple on the ground 2 weeks ago in the opener. Last week against Georgia, the yards were a little bit more difficult to come by, but that Georgia defense with 10 returning starters, very fast, very athletic, very difficult, and we will see the Bulldogs most likely win the SEC Eastern Division. For BC, not a lot of people consider this outside of the ACC circles, that BC in 2014 and 15 had the number 1 total defense and scoring defense in America, and with getting no help from the offense. That's how good Boston College was on defense, and they have regressed to the point where they give up 515 yards rushing, and much of that in the second half, as you mentioned, Mike, when it was predictable that Notre Dame was going to run the ball with a 15 or 20-point lead, and BC gives up that kind of yardage on the ground in 49 points in what at one point through most of the first half was a pretty competitive game. So I don't know what that speaks to in regards to the issues at Boston College coming off a 21-point loss or 24-point loss against Wake as well, a team that's a really solid team but not explosive offensively, that the Boston College defensive scheme and talent and production obviously is not what it was just a couple of years ago.